on Palestine Action. Matt, what did you make, first of all, of what you heard Lord Walney saying there?
Well, I think Lord Walney does say that he supports the right to protest, but I think some have questioned whether his report and his opinions amount to a restriction on our right to protest, because as well as recommending a ban on groups like Palestine Action, Lord Walney has also suggested that we might restrict repeated street protests as well, and that organizers of such protests might be held criminally liable for damages caused by protesters on those marches. So I think some have questioned whether that amounts to a restriction on our right to protest. And also, I think Lord Walney did point out that the ruling found that there were some acts of terrorism, that some of the actions taken by Palestine Action did amount to terrorism. But what he didn't mention was that the ruling found that to be a very small number of actions overall, and that it was therefore disproportionate to prescribe the group.
That it didn't represent the whole of the group. It represented some individuals in the group.
No, that it represented a very small number of actions in the history of the group.
When you were looking into the organisation and the ban, The Truth Behind the Ban is the name of your documentary, what is it you were looking to find out, and what did you find out?
Well, I think if we go back to when Yvette Cooper announced that she would be taking this action to prescribe Palestine Action, around that time, the Home Office briefed journalists suggesting that they're investigating that the group was potentially funded by Iran. Yvette Cooper herself mentioned that the group, she was concerned about disturbing plans for future violence. So the public, the way the government discussed this decision to the public seemed a little bit out of step from what their own internal intelligence report found, which was that it was essentially a small number of cases in which serious property damage meant that the group met the threshold technically for the group to be prescribed as a terrorist organization. However, just because a group technically meets that threshold doesn't mean the government has to prescribe them. It has to be proportionate.
And is there any evidence that it has been funded in part or in whole by Iran?
I interviewed Jonathan Hall, who is the government's independent advisor on terrorism, and he himself described that whole Iran story as nudge, nudge, wink, wink, and said it was wrong.
That's interesting. Did he use that term, nudge, nudge, wink, wink?
Yeah.
Yeah, gosh. And plans for future violence, again, you'd want that evidenced, wouldn't you? And I remember Yvette Cooper saying, because these cases are pending, and actually they still are, so neither you nor I can go into them in great detail, or they're still active, she was alluding to court cases that were up and coming at the time that she was speaking and saying, that'll prove to you why we've banned it. And actually, so far, that has not proved what she hoped it would. And again, I'll say no more about that case because it's still pending. But there was a lot of, we've got this right honestly going on, it seemed to me, about at the time.
I think that we can't talk about the trials that are ongoing, as you said, and there may be evidence that we aren't privy to, that we haven't yet seen. But the government's argument, by and large, when it came down to it, was about serious property damage. And it's important to remember the results of what this ban, the results of this ban. So it did make supporting Palestine Action, organizing meetings in support of Palestine Action, a criminal offense with a potential sentence of up to 14 years. Now, I've spoken to the lead organizers of these protests in support of Palestine Action, and there have been over 2,700 arrests of protesters supporting Palestine Action. They believe that if this stands, we have to see what happens with the government's appeal, that not only would their arrests have been unlawful and therefore void, but that they are entitled to damages from the government. And they plan to demand a meeting with Shabana Mahmood to discuss this, to discuss what they call reparations. And I think, what's significant about this is there is a statutory deprescription process that you can apply for as a banned group, where you go through the deprescription committee. But in that case, which is what happened with the official IRA, it doesn't then say that the original prescription was unlawful. This is the first time that a judicial review has been used in this way. And what that could mean is that, we have to see what happens with the appeal. Yeah. But that could mean that the ban was never lawful in the first place. Which will have its own implications, won't it? Thank you very much indeed, Matt. Thanks for joining me today. Matt Shea, investigative reporter. If you want to check out his documentary, it's on Channel 4. It's called Palestine Action, The Truth Behind the Ban. David says, I think the Palestine Action court case has become this Labour Party's Rwanda plan. What I mean by this is they're going to spend millions of pounds of taxpayers' money fighting in court over something the public don't really care that much about, more because of their own pride than anything else. Well, Shabana Mahmood would say it's because of national security, not pride. But I'm just reading out what David is saying. I'd advise this government to drop this matter and spend the money more productively.
productively. Richard's call from Manchester. Hello, Richard.
Hi there. Thank you for taking my call.
Pleasure.
I want to make a quick correlation, and if you bear with me, you'll understand why. I want to make a correlation between the deafening silence of protests with regard to the massacres taking place in Iran, where in excess of 40 to 50,000 people have been murdered, deliberately murdered by the government, under the veil of internet darkness and various other things, and the absolute absence of protest apart from Iranians, which I participated in giving my support, and the obsessional focus on the Palestinian action and Palestinian movements. Now, where is the correlation? The reason why I think Palestine Action should be banned and was rightly banned, and where I feel the judiciary has overstepped the executive, our elected politicians who've made the right decision, is that they are intrinsically anti-Semitic and they are intrinsically dangerous to Jewish people living in this country. Why do I actually say that? I actually have spoken to a number of these people and I've asked them, have you actually been on any other protests apart from Palestinian protests? And they say, well, we're focusing on this particular issue. So I said, okay, let's just talk about occupations, which you always talk about. When were you last demonstrating about the Indian occupation of Kashmir, or China's occupation of Tibet, or possibly Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara? No, we don't do those. So I say to them, that is because you are intrinsically racist, because you only are focused on the Israel-Palestine issue.
Racist against Jews.
Correct. And as such, they, on that alone, and on their language of globalise the intifada, apart from their criminal activities and their horrendous activities and intimidation practices, they have no right on the streets of a democratic country such as ours. And this is not putting a silence on Palestinian protests. Quite the contrary. There are more Palestinian opposition groups in this country than any other possible protest. Let's get rid of the dangerous, illegal, terrorist ones who are intrinsically racial, race hatred orientated, and let people have legitimate protest on the streets, but not Palestine Action.
And when you say the High Court has overstepped the executive, I mean, that's always a bit of a dance, isn't it? And that dance is meant to happen in our system. Do you know what I mean when I say that? The dance between the judiciary and politicians.
Yeah, I completely understand what you say. And it's a real problem. It's something that people have to get their head around, because you have, on the one hand, elected people that I voted for, you voted for, that we want to make the laws of this country. And then you have unelected people, judges and the like, who then can effectively change that.
And I didn't agree with everything you said there about all Palestinian groups, but I would agree with you that the reason, on the specific question of why we haven't seen the scale of protests for Iranian civilians, it's because it's very simple. Iran hates Israel, therefore, let's not go out onto the streets and denigrate Iran. That's what that's about.
So, in other words, we have selective morality.
Yeah, of course.
So the fact that people are being murdered, men, women and children, deliberately targeted by the Iranian regime because of the blind hatred for Israel, the blind hatred for the only Jewish state in this country, they somehow turn a blind eye to those massacres. Shame on them.
Well, I would agree with you. Richard says by text, so if Palestine Action are prescribed as a terror organisation, what about Stop Oil protesters, Just Stop Oil protesters? They've caused so much damage. Also, William says they're Palestine Action. The group exists to focus on issues related to Palestinian people. I don't think saying they don't protest about Tibet proves they're racist. That's not their focus, says William. Catherine in Muswell Hill. Hello, Catherine.
Hello, Sheila. I was always a bit bemused and worried about this proscription. It never seemed to me to be appropriate. It always felt a political rather than a legal decision. We have ample public order legislation and criminal damage legislation to deal with behaviour that we think crosses the line into criminal.
But on the distinction, if I may, on the distinction between political and legal, I mean, if something is terrorism, if it is, an organisation is terroristic in its aims, then that is political, isn't it?
No, that's fair. That is a fair point. But you're going to have to bring the line down somewhere whenever you legislate, aren't you? You're going to have to.
You draw it somewhere,
Yeah, you're going to have to draw it somewhere. And I always felt that, and the more I've followed it, the more I've thought, essentially we have plenty of public order legislation, and provided that legislation is impartially and apolitically applied by the police in how they police these protests and so on, then really, why did it need to be proscribed? And it always felt to me, it felt wrong, first and foremost. It also felt dangerous, politically dangerous.
Because it was so easy to mock this law, which is clearly what lots of people were doing.
It was easy to mock this law, and it was easy also to make it sort of evidence of some kind of influence or higher hand that was sort of I don't know, manufacturing some greater plan. You know, it felt a gift to those who might think, oh gosh, who's actually in charge here? And that really worried me. But mostly.
Sorry, in what way do you think it felt a gift to people who think who's in charge here?
Because I felt that why was our government proscribing an organisation who, on the face of it, and I have no reason to disbelieve that, were saying we want to support the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause.
It wasn't. The government isn't arguing against that. It's arguing against their methods, isn't it? And making claims about their methods, which are currently being tested in court.
Well, it was Yvette Cooper at the time, wasn't it? She was the Home Secretary. And when she was pressed on that, and to be fair to her, obviously all this stuff is classified, she was like, oh, well, you don't know the half of it.
But she said you don't know the half of it, but you will because of certain court cases, which you and I are not going to discuss now. But even they have proved to be, so far anyway, inconclusive, haven't they?
Well, precisely. So either we keep it as a very high bar, and it needs to be a high bar if it's going to have legitimacy and public confidence in the whole process of it, or we just yet again undermine it and make it look like a political decision rather than one. You
feel it's been too hasty, the government, do you?
It's been too hasty, and I'm sorry to feel it was essentially wrong. We have the legislation to deal with criminal acts that take place, you know, within the auspices of that movement, as applies to every other protest and organisation that might want to lobby for change. And that needs to be implemented, as I said, impartially and apolitically. End of.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. Let's hear from Marie and Paisley. Is it Marie or Mary, Paisley?
Marie.
Marie, hello.
Marie. Hi, thanks, Sheila, for having me on.
Pleasure.
First of all, I'd like to pick up on a couple of points, but not by the last gentleman caller, the one before him, who seemed to think that everyone that went on Palestine marches in support of Palestine were anti-Semitic. I'd just like to clarify this continued conflation. The continued conflation.
I don't think he quite said that, but anyway.
Anti-Semitic, I think he did. Anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are very, very different things. There are thousands, probably millions, of Jewish people around the world who have marched for Palestine. And also the Iranian thing, I want to pick up on his point on what he said about there's no sign of any people who march for Palestine, marching for Iran. The difference here is that people in this country who are on the Palestine marches, we're protesting against our government's continued involvement
with Israel.
We have continued to supply weapons. So by marching, we have been trying to put pressure on our government in the UK. Now, there's no point, and I say there's no point, I totally understand why Iranians march here. It must be horrendous.
So why the need in those protests then for pictures of waste paper bins with babies being put into them with a Star of David attached?
I don't know anything about the Iranian marches.
I'm talking about the pro-Palestinian marches where we've seen things like that.
Did you see pictures of? Did you see pictures of babies being put into waste bins?
Yeah, like posters.
I know absolutely nothing about that, but what I do know that there's a lot of stuff posted by bots or whoever online. I've been on hundreds of pro-Palestine marches, and I haven't seen any of that. All the marches are always peaceful. The only unrest and non-peace that I have seen in these marches has actually been from police, and coincidentally or not, the worst police response has been at arms factories, and that brings us back to Palestine Action. The reason the government prescribed Palestine Action is because Palestine Action were making a difference, destroying weapons, and there has been more outrage over weapons, criminal damage to weapons from which arms factories and the shareholders have make a literal killing. There has been more outrage over arms factories being damaged than actual babies and children and men and women being blown to bits in Gaza.
Well, the government they're not here to defend themselves, but they would say to you on that, Marie, that they believe that to be a matter of national security. A judgment made about our national security if it's defence sites is what they would say. Take that or leave it, but it is what they would say. Thank you.